Hi, second grade. Time for Charlotte's Web. I want to shout out Daniel and Daisy. They both sent me a message, Daniel through Dojo and Daisy through Seesaw, that we have 108 pages left. So good job with your subtraction. Nice job, both of you. That's Daniel and Daisy. Chapter 10 was last time, and I think I forgot to show you the pictures. So here's when Charlotte was upside down on her web, and she was trying to think of a plan to save Wilbur. So there's Charlotte, and then here is one of my favorite pictures. This is Fern and Avery when they were on the swing. So, and it is my favorite because when I was growing up, my neighbor owned a farm, and they had a barn just like this with a swing just like that. And we used to do the same thing. So this is called a hayloft. And yes, Mrs. Fulop was born in a very rural area where most of my friends own farms. My parents did not, but most of my friends did. So I'm very familiar with barns and animals. So this is the barn, and this is called a hayloft, and it's where they keep the hay. And it always has this ladder that you can climb up to put the hay bales up there. So there's Avery, and he's sitting up on the hay. And so what you will do is you climb over to the ladder and you grab the rope and then you slide down it, and there's a big knot at the end that stops your body from sliding off. And then that's where you sit, and then you swing back and forth. And it's so much fun, and it reminds me of when I was young and used to do the same thing. So that was a cool picture. And then the last picture is when he fell over the Wilbur's trough, which is where they put his food. It's kind of like a bowl, but it's for an animal. It's called a trough. And if you remember, if you can see, there's Templeton, and he that's his nest, and he is underneath. And then that's when the egg was broken, and there was the explosion, and it smelled awful. So when we stopped reading last time, Charlotte was trying to save Wilbur's life. And if I remember, she was working on her web. So let's see what went on with her web. That sounds pretty important. This is chapter 11, and it's called The Miracle. Miracle is something amazing that happens. The next day was foggy. Everything on the farm was dripping wet. The grass looked like a magic carpet. The asparagus patch looked like a silver forest. On foggy mornings, Charlotte's web was truly a thing of beauty. This morning, each thin strand was decorated with dozens of tiny beads of water. The web glistened in the light and made a pattern of loveliness and mystery, like a delicate veil that a bride would wear. Even Lurvy, who wasn't particularly interested in beauty, noticed the web when he came to feed Wilbur's for breakfast. He noticed how clearly it showed up, and he noted how big and carefully built it was. And then he took another look, and he saw something that made him set his pail down. There, in the center of the web, neatly woven in block letters, was a message. It said, "Some pig," with an exclamation mark. Lurvy felt weak. He brushed his hands across his eyes, and he stared harder at Charlotte's web. "I'm seeing things," he whispered. He dropped to his knees, and he uttered a prayer. Then, forgetting all about Wilbur's breakfast, he walked back to the house and called out for Mr. Zuckerman. "I think you better come down to the pig pen," he said. "Why? What's the trouble?" asked Mr. Zuckerman. "Is something wrong with the pig?" "No, not exactly," said Lurvy. "Just come and see for yourself." The two men walked silently down to Wilbur's yard. Lurvy pointed to the spider's web. "Do you see what I see?" he asked. Zuckerman stared at the writing on the web, and then he murmured the words, "Some pig." Then he looked at Lurvy, and then both men began to tremble. Charlotte sleepy after her night's exertions, smiled as she watched. Wilbur came and stood directly under the web. "Some pig," muttered Lurvy in a low voice. "Some pig," whispered Mr. Zuckerman. They stared and stared for a long time at Wilbur, and then they stared at Charlotte. "You don't suppose that spider," began Mr. Zuckerman. But he shook his head and he didn't finish his sentence. Instead, he walked solemnly back up to the house and spoke to his wife. "Edith, something has happened," he said in a weak voice. He went into the living room and sat down, and Mrs. Zuckerman followed. "I have something to tell you, Edith," he said. "You better sit down." Mrs. Zuckerman sank into the chair. She looked pale and frightened. "Edith," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I think you better be told that we have a very unusual pig." A look of complete bewilderment came over Mrs. Zuckerman's face. "Homer Zuckerman, what in the world are you talking about?" "This is a very serious thing, Edith," he replied. "Our pig is completely out of the ordinary." "Why? What's unusual about the pig?" asked Mrs. Zuckerman, who was beginning to not feel so scared. "Well, I don't really know yet," said Mr. Zuckerman, "but we received a sign, Edith, a mysterious sign. A miracle just happened on this farm. There's a large spider web in the doorway of the barn cellar, right over the pig pen. And when Lurvy went to feed the pig this morning, he noticed the web because it was foggy. You know how a spider's web looks very distinct in the fog? And right in the middle of the web were two words, 'Some pig.' The words were woven into the web. They were actually part of the web. Edith, I know because I have been down there and I saw it, and it says 'Some pig,' just as clear can be. There's no mistake about it. A miracle has happened. A sign has occurred here on earth, right in front of our eyes, on our farm. We have no ordinary pig." "Well," said Mrs. Zuckerman, "it seems to me you're a little off. I think we have no ordinary spider." "Oh, no, said Mr. Zuckerman. "It's the pig that's unusual. It says so right there in the middle of the web." "Well, maybe so," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "Just the same, I think we should look at the spider." "It's just a common gray spider," said Zuckerman. They got up together and they walked down to Wilbur's pig pen. "You see, Edith, see the spider? It's a common gray spider." Wilbur was pleased to be receiving so much attention. Lurvy was still standing there, and Mr. and Mrs. Zuckerman and all three of them stood for about an hour. They kept reading the words over and over again and watching Wilbur. Charlotte was delighted with the way her trick was working. She sat without moving a muscle, and she listened to the conversation of the people. When a small fly blundered into the web, just beyond the word pig, Charlotte dropped quickly. She rolled the fly up, and she carried it out of the way. After a little while, the fog lifted. The web dried off, and the words didn't show up so plainly. The Zuckermans and Lurvy walked back up to the house, and just before they left the pig pen, Mr. Zuckerman took one last look at Wilbur. "You know," he said in an important voice, "I've thought all along that pig was extra good. He's a solid pig. That pig is solid as they come. Do you see how solid he is, like around his shoulders, Lurvy?" "Oh, sure, I do," said Lurvy. "Always noticed that pig. That is quite a pig." "He's long and he's smooth," said Mr. Zuckerman. "That's right," agreed Lurvy. "He's as smooth as they come. He is some pig." When Mr. Zuckerman got back to the house, he took off his work clothes and he put on his best suit. Then he got in his car and he drove to his pastor's house. He stayed for an hour and explained to the pastor that a miracle happened on the farm. So far, said Mr. Zuckerman, only 4 people on earth know about this, and I call it a miracle. Myself, my wife Edith, my hired helper, his name's Lurvy, and you. Well, don't tell anybody else, said the pastor. We don't know what it means yet. Perhaps if I give some thought to it, I can explain it next Sunday when we all come to church. There's no doubt about it that you have an unusual pig. I intend to speak about it in my sermon and point out to this community that we have a wonderful animal. By the way, what's the pig's name? Oh, his name, yes, said Mr. Zuckerman. My little niece named him. She calls him Wilbur. She's an interesting child. She's full of crazy ideas. She raised the pig on a bottle, and then I bought him from her when he was 1 month old. He shook hands with the pastor and he left. Secrets are hard to keep, and before Sunday, everybody came because the news spread all over the county. Everybody knew that a sign appeared on the spider's web in Zuckerman's barn. Everyone knew that the Zuckermans had a wonderful pig. People came from miles around to look at the wonderful pig named Wilbur and to read the words in Charlotte's Web. The Zuckermans' driveway was full of cars and trucks from morning until night. Trucks that were made by the company of Ford, Chevy, Buick, GMC, and Plymouth, Oldsmobile and Jeep and Pontiacs. The news of the wonderful pigs spread clear up the hills, and farmers came in their buggies, rattling down the hill. They would stand for an hour at Wilbur's pig pen, admiring the miraculous animal. All of them said they've never seen such a special pig before in their whole life. When Fern told her mother that Avery tried to hit that spider with a stick, Mrs. Arble was so shocked she sent Avery to bed and didn't even give him any supper. That was his punishment for trying to hurt the spider. In the days that followed, Mr. Zuckerman was so busy entertaining all the visitors that he neglected his farm work. He wore his good clothes all the time now. He got into them when he woke up in the morning. Mrs. Zuckerman prepared special meals for Wilbur. Lurvy shaved his beard and got a haircut. And his main duty now on the farm was to take care of the pig. Mr. Zuckerman ordered Lurvy to increase Wilbur's feeding from 3 meals a day to 4 meals a day. And the Zuckermans were so busy with all the visitors coming to their farm that they forgot about their jobs on the farm. So the blackberries got ripe, and Mrs. Zuckerman forgot to pick them, and they didn't have blackberries to make blackberry jam. The corn needed to be weeded around it. Lurvy didn't have time to do it, so the weeds grew very tall. On Sunday, the church was full, and the pastor explained the miracle. He said that the words on the spider web proved that human beings must always be on the watch for wonderful things. All in all, the Zuckerman's pig pen was the center of attention. Fern was happy. She felt for sure that Charlotte's trick was working, and Wilbur's life would be saved. But she found that the animals in the barn weren't nearly as pleasant. Plus, there were so many people in the barn. She liked it better when she was alone with just the animals. That is the end of chapter 11. We had it on page 85. So if you want to subtract, it's 184 minus 85. And I'm not going to forget the pictures today. We had some pig. And the farm with all the people. I All right, second grade, I hope you enjoyed chapter 11. I'll read chapter 12 tomorrow. I wish we were in the classroom and I was reading it to you like I used to when we would come in from recess and we'd put our heads down and we'd chill and listen to Mrs. Fulop read with the lights off. Oh, I'm sorry. Bye-bye, second grade.